few months back, I did a blog post about 3 marketing examples of the offset function. And you can check that out here. I'll provide a link in the video and the blog post. But truth be told, I'm actually not a big fan of the offset function. The reason for that is it's a very volatile function. So every time you update something in your Excel workbook, the offset function runs again. And if you have a large workbook or you have a dashboard where you have a lot going on, that can really cripple Excel. So today what I'm going to talk about is the index alternative to the offset function. I can't think of a single example where you can't use the index function in lieu of the offset function. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this post where I give the 3 examples and I'm going to show index alternatives for each of them. So the index function takes a little getting used to, especially if you're used to an offset function. But once you understand the logic of it, I think you'll see it's a much preferable function. The first example that I used was the dynamic named range. And with the Excel file that came with the offset post, you'll see a tab like this, dynamic named range, and it uses all offset functions. So the reason you would use a dynamic named range is if you use formatted tables, and I have a pretty extensive guide in how to use formatted tables in Excel. I absolutely love them. I use them all the time. One benefit to a formatted table, which I don't use here, is that if your data range is always expanding, like let's say you're adding a new row every month or every week or every day, and it's only expanding, it's not contracting, then if you use a formatted table, which you would get to by just selecting any cell inside your data range and choose format as a table, then what will happen is whenever you have new data that's added, your chart will automatically update with the new data, which is great. One serious drawback to formatted tables, which I've run by the Microsoft team, specifically the Excel teams for both PC and Mac, is that if your data range contracts, the table doesn't update. So if next month, instead of having 5 rows, I had 4 rows, the formatted table will still go down to here, which will give us an unsightly gap in our chart, which isn't ideal. So if you have data that could expand or contract, such as reporting dashboards, and I have a whole course on how to build out reporting dashboards using Google Analytics API data, if you have data that can contract, then what you need to use are dynamic named ranges. So what we're doing with a dynamic named range is we're saying instead of cells B4 to B8, let's say next month we run a billboard campaign and we also throw in CPC. So this range here might go down to B10. And if those are hard-coded in and the chart references the hard-coded B4 to B8, then you're going to miss out on these 2 rows here. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell Excel that the range for medium, which populates down here in the axis, will always start at B4, but then go ahead and find the last cell in this range, and that's going to be our entire data range. So let's see what that looks like. So to build out a dynamic named range, you're going to go into formulas and define name. The problem is this dialog here doesn't give you any tooltips, which is super lame. So what I recommend doing is building out your formula while in Excel and then taking the formula and copying and pasting it into the name manager. So that's what we're going to do. We'll just do it in this cell over here. The first thing we're going to do is say, okay, well, as I mentioned before, this range here always starts at B4. Now, also, if you didn't watch the offset video, when you're creating formulas that will go into the name manager, everything has to be locked down. In other words, everything has to be absolute. Every cell reference needs to have the $signs in front. So let's start here by saying, okay, we know it's B4. What we don't know is what is the last cell in this range. Now, typically what I would do is press F4 or Command T if you're on a Mac to lock that down. Although there's a little bug in Excel where as soon as you add the colon, it unlocks it. So then obviously our range isn't B4 to B4, so we're going to delete that second B4 and then go back in here and lock it down. After you've built a few of these, you'll just get used to that bug, and now I don't lock it down until after I enter the colon. So now what we're going to use is the index function to figure out where that last cell is. So let's start typing in index. And the first thing it's going to ask us for is the array. Now, these cells are free, so you want to be generous and you want to be realistic. If your range could realistically in a few months go all the way down to B300, then go ahead and choose B300. In our case, most people probably aren't going to have more than, let's say, 16 mediums. You definitely should not have more than that unless you're like Facebook or Walmart or something. Even then, that's questionable. So I'm just going to, just for the sake of generosity, I'm going to choose B4 to B20. And I'm going to press F4 to lock that down. Now what we need to tell Excel is what's the row number. We know this is the total array, but what's the row number? In other words, what's the row number of the last value? Because when we figure that out, we'll have our full range. We hard-coded the B4, but now we're using a formula to figure out the last one. And what we're going to use to get that is the count A function, which I also talked about in the last video. All count A does is it just counts the cells that have some kind of value in it. You can also use the count function for numbers, but the count function doesn't work for text. So if you have text, you need to use count A. However, the count A function also works for numbers. So when we build out the dynamic named ranges for numbers, you can either keep it as count A or you can update it to count. So here we're going to choose the same range that we chose here, the B4 to B20. So I'm going to go ahead, select that, and again, everything has to be locked down. Now it's going to ask us for the column number. See these square brackets here? That means that this is an optional parameter. We don't need it. So we're just going to go ahead and close this up. Now, if I press enter now, I'm going to get this value error. That's because Excel doesn't know what to do with it. If you want to test it to make sure that it works properly, and I'm going to first go ahead and copy this because I know that I'm going to need it. To test this, we're going to wrap the whole thing in a count A function, because if this is working properly, we should get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm just going to use the arrow. And we get 5. Now, let's test it to make sure it expands. Yep, it expands. You can also test it to make sure that it contracts, and it does. So we're just going to go ahead and delete this test. So now what we're going to do is go up here into Formulas, Define Names, Define Name. And the first thing you're going to do is set a name for your named range. If you have multiple data ranges that require dynamic named ranges, what I recommend doing is prepending the name with something that kind of will group all of those together. Because if you have a whole bunch of dynamic named ranges, which if you're building out a dashboard, you typically will, I want to see those all grouped together because Excel alphabetizes those. It just makes it a lot easier to edit things down the road. So I could call this channels, because these are all marketing channels. I'll typically make it as short as possible, so I'm just going to say MC for marketing channels. That's typically what I go with. And I'll call this medium. Now, instead of this being hard-coded, we're going to take that formula that we built and just paste that in. And what Excel is going to do is it's going to add in the name of this particular sheet, which is dynamic named range. And click OK. Now let's go back into our name manager and test it. The best way to test this is just to select inside this range. And if the marching ants are around your range, then you'll know it's working properly. So let me close out of this and add test like we did before. Go back into our name manager, click inside again, and you'll see it updated to include test. So that's perfect. Now if we click this and click edit, you'll see here where it added the sheet name in front. So you don't have to add that. Excel will add it for you. Now what I'll typically do is I'll just grab this whole thing here Well, actually, I already have it on the dashboard still. And what we'll want to do to create the named range for sessions, revenue, and bounce rate is just switch out the B's for C's, and then the C's for D's, and the D's for E's. So I don't want to have to manually build that out each time. So I figured out a cheat that works really well for me. So what I'll do is I'll just paste the formula into Excel and then choose Control or Command F for find and choose replace. And then I'll just type in $B. That's so that I make sure I'm only getting the B's inside formulas here. And then I want to replace it with $C. And I'm going to press replace all. Great. Now, for efficiency's sake, I realized that you don't even have to close out of the find and replace dialog. So when I get going with these, I'll just fly back and forth between Word and Excel. So what we're going to do is copy that, come back into our name manager. We could either go into define name or go into our name manager and choose new. And for this, we'll call this MC Sessions, and paste this in. Click inside here. Perfect. Add another one. Go back here, and I'll say, okay, well, replace $C with $D. Choose my Word file here, select this. And again, like I said before, because these are numbers, you could update this count A function to just use the count function. But it works fine the way it is, so why take an extra step when you don't have to? So let's select that, go back into Excel. We'll call this MC Revenue. And we'll just paste this in. And for our last one, let's go back into Word. Replace D with E, replace all. Now we can close out of this. Go back into Excel. We'll call this MC bounce rate. You can call it whatever you want. You could call it MCBR, as long as it makes sense to you. Paste that function in and test it. Perfect. So now what we're going to do is, first of all, delete that. We don't need this anymore. And if you want to learn how to create a combination chart like this, I have a blog post on it with a video tutorial. And we're going to right-click on this and choose Select Data. And what we're going to do here is replace each of these, replace the horizontal axis labels and each of the legend entries, which are called data series, with our dynamic named ranges. So let's go into the axis labels first, and those are the mediums which populate to the axis here. And we're going to click Edit, and you want to carefully choose just the range here, because we don't want it to be hard-coded to B4 to B8 anymore. We want to replace that with our dynamic named range, but you don't want to get rid of the reference here. So on the PC, you can press F3 to pull up your paste name dialog. On the Mac, you just need to type it in. So we would choose MC medium here, and we'll click OK. Now let's go in and edit it and just select it. And if you have it set up correctly, you'll see the marching ants around your mediums. Let's cancel out of this. Let's click OK. And let's add in a test again. You can't be too careful with these, especially when you're new to it. So I'm going to choose edit again, and notice how it updated to include test. Perfect. Okay, next up, let's replace sessions. So if we come in here and press edit, first you'll see the series name, which is just pointing to sessions. That's fine. You don't need to update that. But here you'll see the marching ants are around your session values. Just like we did before, we're going to very carefully choose, oh, this side actually already set up. So here you can type it in, or again, if you're on a PC, I would just use F3 to dummy-proof your data. Okay, now let's go in and do the same thing for revenue. Again, we don't need to update that. That's fine. That can be hard-coded. We're going to choose the range here and replace that with revenue. And finally, bounce rate. Now, your chart is totally dynamic, so that, let's say next month, we're not running social at all. And we delete this, notice how social just disappears. If you're using a table, that's not going to update. If we put it back, then notice social reappears. If I added something else with all new values, let's say we run a billboard campaign and we get 200 sessions, it generates $231, and the bounce rate is 36%, you'll see that here. If we update that to 2,000, oh, that's throwing us off. Let's update that to 20,000. There you go. You'll see those there. So that's how you can use the index function for dynamic named ranges. Okay, next up we have dynamic data validation. Again, we set this up with an offset function in the previous video. This time we're going to use the index function. So first of all, what data validation allows you to do is create drop-down lists in Excel that restricts someone's options. So instead of typing out guest post, an infographic, press release, which increases the risk of error because someone may transpose the U and the E and mess up your data, you can create these drop-down lists that restrict their options in a particular range of cells, and then they just choose from the options. And you would just take this and you can paste it, and then they can select and choose a different option. So it's very cool. The problem is that, let's say we add something new. This list here doesn't update because we're hard coding the range typically. We're saying our list is in B4 to B9. But if that list grows, like if we have a new content strategy or we get rid of a content strategy and this list shrinks, then you have to go in and manually update this. So the way that you create a data validation dropdown like this is typically you'll just go to data, data validation, choose to allow a list, and for your source, you'll select that source. And now we have this dropdown. What we're going to do is create a dynamic named range just like we did over here, and then we're just going to reference that dynamic named range. That way, if our list expands or contracts, that dynamic named range will update, and so will our dropdown. So let's see what that looks like. So just as we did before, we're going to build out the formula in Excel and then paste it into the named manager. So first, we want to hard code this because we know that this list is always going to start in B4. And again, I shouldn't have done that because it just gets rid of them, which is just so silly. Lock that down again. And now we're going to use an index function in concert with a count A function to find the last cell that has a value. So Let's type in index. Our array, again, these are free, be generous, but not crazy. Like, you never want to select an entire column because it's just too much. Excel has to go down that entire column to find value. So you don't want to get crazy with it, but you just don't want to hamstring yourself. So that's our array. For the row number, just as we did before, we're going to use the count A function and choose that same range, lock it down, and we're golden. Now, if you want to test this, just as we did before, you could wrap the whole thing in a count A function. Just get to the end here. Add another parenthesis. This is 6. Let's add a 7th. And perfect. Okay, so now let's go to formulas, define name. And I typically will prepend data validations with DV. That groups all of my data validation dropdowns together. And we'll call this content strategies. And we're going to just replace this with our formula. Again, just as we did before, you can test it, select it, the marching ants, great. Let's type in something else. Let's go back into the name manager. All we have to do is click inside here. It updates. Perfect. You can't test these things enough. And now let's go into our data validation by going to data, data tools, data validation. And we're going to update the source with, well, on the PC, we'll just use F3 and select it. Now watch what happens when I add a new value. It updates here. And if I update it again, it updates again. So perfect. That's how you can do that. All right, on to our last example. So Google Analytics gives you the ability to compare different date ranges. But if you export one of those date ranges, here's what it looks like in Excel. Now, the export used to be a lot worse, like much worse. So they did clean the export up quite a bit. However, you still can't chart that. So what we have to do is we need one row for each medium. And then because these are going to be different data series, we'll have a data series for last month and a data series for last year. What this is allowing us to do is look at year-over-year data. And because these are going to be individual data series, we need them to be individual columns in our data set here. So we're going to need to use the index function to make this happen. So let's go ahead, and that's what we started with. This gets a little hairy. You may need to watch this part of the video a couple times. I still have to think about what I'm doing here. For the first value, we're just going to go ahead and reference it. So our first medium is organic. What I did here is I just ported over all of the data that I used for the offset video, and we're using that for the index video. So last month was in February, but let's pretend it is. And here, those visits are here, and the year before, those are here, because you can see February 2014 and February 2013. Now what we have to do is figure out a way to get each of these to skip a row. So we're starting here, but then we need to skip the second organic and jump to referral. And then we need it to jump to the first none, which is direct, and then to email, and then to social. And let's see how we can do that using the index function. So what we're going to do here is start to type in index. And for our array, and again, this takes a little bit of getting used to, but we're going to start it here. Hopefully it'll make sense when you see the whole thing. And we're going to lock this down. The reason we're locking this down is when we go down, we still want to start from B5. So for the row number, what we need is a way for these to increment. So at first, we want this to go down 2 cells because we want to go from here down to here. But then we want it to jump down 4 cells. So we want it to go from here to 1, well, not jump down 4 cells, but jump down to the 4th cell of this range. So that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the first, none. And then 6, and then 8. There are probably different ways that you can do this, but when I need to increment something, usually if I'm incrementing something by 1, I'll just use the row function or the column function depending on what direction you're going. Let me show you how that works. So what the row function does, and let me just go ahead, put a single quotation mark in here to turn this to text. And let's see some examples. So if I say row of K1, it just returns a 1. It just says that K1 is the first cell. It just tells you that K1 is the first row. It just tells you that K1 is in the first row of this entire worksheet. So, as you might imagine, K2 is in row 2, K3 is in row 3, etc. So you see row of K1 returns 1, row of K2 returns 2, etc., etc. Now, because we want these to increment by 2, what we're going to do is use the row function but multiply it by 2. So then it'll be just like taking 1, multiplying it by 2, and we're going to get 2, 4, 6, and 8. And that's what we want. We want those to increment by 2. So let's go in here. Now, we can choose any cell that's in the first row. So I could always use A1, or typically what I'll do is just use B1. Yeah, I'll just use whatever column I'm in. It's completely up to you. So I'll just select B1 here. And we're not going to lock that down because when we drag it down, we want this to update from B1 to B2, B3. Because when I drag this down, I want this to update from B1 to B2 to B3 to B4, etc. Okay, now what we're going to do to multiply this by 2, we just type in an asterisk and 2. Now we don't need the column number because we're just working with one column and we can see that it's optional anyway. So we're just going to close this up and let's see how this works. Perfect. It grabbed referral. So we have organic and then referral. Now, the reason that this array started in B5 is if I chose B4, then the second row is still going to be organic. So that's why I started with B5 and dragged it down. Now, let's see what happens when we drag it down. Now we get none because it jumped by 2. You can see here, now it's referencing the row of B2, and we'll drag it down 2 more to get email and social. Perfect. That's exactly what we want. All right, so now we have to use the same strategy to get 3005. We want that here. We want 2947, etc., etc. So we're going to use the same strategy. We're going to say index. We're going to start here with our range because, again, we want that second row to grab this. So that may not be terribly intuitive when you first start out, but it works. So now we need the row number, and just as we did before, we could just use B1. In fact, I can just type it in. B1. Oops, sorry. Type row B1 times 2. And we see that we get 3005, which coordinates with referral. Let's see when we drag this down. We get 2021, 1645, 1386. These all refer to the previous month. Now we're going to do the same thing for last year. In fact, we could have made this so that we could drag it over. Let's go ahead and do that. So let's take this, and what we want to do is when we drag this over, we want the column to stay the same. No, you know what? All right, so let's do this again, just for the practice. We're going to use the index function, just like we did before. Now keep in mind, we want to grab this value here first, because we want referral for last year. So for our array, this time we're going to start here and drag it down, lock it down. And for our row number, we're going to use the row function just as we did before. And we can use B1, we'll just type that in, and we'll multiply it by 2. That gives us 2947 when we drag it down. That gives us 1235, 852, and 482. And you can see the chart here updated automatically. But you can create it from scratch by just clicking inside, saying insert, and this is just a clustered column. And then I just took it and cleaned it up. I have other videos on how to clean up your charts. Now, alternatively, you can use a pivot table to create your chart. You couldn't with how Google Analytics used to export the data, but you can see here that I've used a pivot table and then built a pivot chart from the pivot table. You can do that if you're on a PC. If you're on a Mac, you need to create a regular static chart from your pivot table because Macs don't support pivot charts. So the way that you would do that is just select any cell in here and go to Insert, Tables, Pivot Table. We'll just put in a new worksheet. And then you would drag medium down to rows. That'll give you your mediums. And date range to columns. And you can see here, this is the date range for one, this is the date range for the other. And drag visits. This should be updated to sessions. But then you can go in here and clean this up. So I wouldn't want the actual dates because in your chart, that's going to look kind of messy. So I would update that to last year and last month. And it's up to you if you want a total. In pivot tables, I really don't like the ground. So if I do keep a total row, I just change ground to total. Now if we go to Insert and we choose a chart, now we have a nice pivot chart here. Again, just like with anything else, you'd want to go in here and clean things up. Like for example, I personally don't prefer having these buttons in my chart. I think they look pretty nasty. So I just go in here, right click on one and choose Hide All Field Buttons on Chart. Now I have last month and last year. I'll typically move this to the top. I'll get rid of the grid lines or at least reduce them in intensity. I'll thin this out, etc., etc. So you'll just want to clean this up. Again, I have other videos on how to clean up your data and make it sexy, but this is the alternative to using the index function. So there you go. Index alternatives to all of the offset functions I showed you before.